Well, have you ever surprised yourself by something that you did? In a moment, maybe it was something you said, but you were kind of shocked when you did it or you said it because it's like you didn't know you had it in you. You know, it was maybe something you didn't even know you could do, right? So maybe you've had an experience like that. Amanda had a moment like this several years ago, and I have her permission to share this with you, but actually Amanda's not even here today, so I can kind of say whatever I want. And she's in Indiana with our two oldest daughters and our grandson, and in fact, she's going to be flying back tonight with Brianna and Miles, and we're going to have Bree and Miles with us until the 1st of April. So, in fact, you might even get to meet Miles if you're here next Sunday. So, let that kind of be the attraction to come back next Sunday. You can maybe meet my grandson. But anyway, so Amanda, she had this moment several years ago, and I don't know if you knew this about Amanda, but she played volleyball all 4 years in college. In fact, she wasn't just a volleyball player, she was actually an outstanding volleyball player. Like all 4 years, she was recognized for her outstanding abilities, just an all-around player. Now, this is where she would want me to kind of insert this little caveat that we went to a very small campus, which is true, a very small school, but nonetheless, I mean, for most of those 4 years, she was like the heart and soul of that team, and both because of her skill as a player, but also because of her competitive drive and her competitive spirit. And you may not know this about Amanda, but she is a fierce competitor. Like probably most of you have never seen that side of her, and I pray you never will, because she is fierce. And in fact, my sweet, loving, kind, and gentle wife made her teammates cry on occasion, because that's how driven she was to perform and to succeed. And so, in fact, her coach loved it. Her coach was always like, yeah, Amanda, let him have it. Make him cry. It's awesome. But seriously, Amanda was just an excellent player. I mean, she was just an outstanding player, a leader on and off the court. And she just had a way of elevating the players around her. And that's not just me bragging. In fact, 6 years ago, she was actually acknowledged for this. She was inducted into our school's Athletic Hall of Fame for her contributions to the volleyball program from 1995 to 1999. And it was this whole thing, right? She got this letter, and she was invited to this gathering of alumni, and there was like this going to be this dinner and a whole ceremony of things. And there were other athletes being honored at that occasion as well, but she was one of them, and she was going to be receiving this award, and she would have an opportunity to say a few words as she accepted that award. And she was terrified of this. Like super stressed out. I mean, here's something you might know about Amanda. She hates being in front of people, like a crowd like this. She hates being up in front in the spotlight. In fact, what she hates even more is having to talk to a crowd of people. And so she was dreading this moment of receiving this award. We almost didn't even go. But I'm watching my wife in this ceremony, and I'm watching her up in front of all these people. She's receiving this award. She's talking to this room full of people. And she was so articulate and well-spoken. She was just speaking off the cuff, like she didn't have anything prepared, nothing rehearsed or anything like that. And she seemed so natural and so calm. And she didn't even make any of her old teammates cry, which was really good. And so she gets back to the table after she received this award. She sits down next to me, and I'm just like, so proud of her. And she leans over to me, and she says, I have no idea what I just said. I might have blacked out for those few minutes there. Did I say anything stupid or embarrassing? Like, do I need to apologize to anyone after this? And of course, I was like, no, you were awesome. But that was one of those moments for Amanda. Like, I didn't even know I could do this. I didn't think I had it in me. And maybe you had moments like that too, moments where you just sort of surprised yourself by stepping up and facing something head on, and you had no idea you could do that. And even if you hope you never have to do it again, there's something about those moments, something about those kind of experiences that just feels like empowering, doesn't it? Like it feels good. Now the flip side of that is this tendency that I think we all have to talk ourselves out of something, or really anything, if it feels beyond our immediate capacity. Like if I doubt for even a moment that I have it in me to do something or to say something or to face something, then I'd rather just not even try. Right? Sometimes we see these challenges or opportunities in front of us, and they're so big, they're so beyond us, we look at them and we think, I could never do that. I could just never do that. In fact, just a moment of honesty with you this morning, for a long time, this is how I thought about what I'm doing right now as a lead pastor. I mean, some of you know a little bit of my story, but I was in ministry full-time as a pastor for 20 years before I stepped into a lead pastor role like this. And so during those 20 years, at times people would talk to me and ask me if this was something that I ever, thought I would pursue or something like that. And I just always had this thought. Anytime I thought about that, I thought, I just don't know if I could do that. And here's why I thought that. I was afraid of running out of things to say. Like I would run out of things to say, which sounds so funny, right? I mean, it's a big Bible. There's a lot to talk about. But what if I run out of things to say? And I mean, I used to, those first 20 years, I would rotate in and I would preach messages like this, and I would think I could do a decent message from once in a while if it's every 5 or 6 times a year. But if I'm doing this 30 to 40 times a year every year, how am I going to do that? And then I remember hearing a preacher give this advice. He said, just speak from your weaknesses and not your strength. And I thought, well, if that's the case, I've got lots of material to work with. So maybe I could do this after all. But I resisted this for a long time. And here's why I think we do this. Why I think all of us do this at times. We see tomorrow's opportunities through the lens of yesterday's limitations. Don't we do this? I mean, we see the opportunities in front of us, the opportunities of tomorrow through this lens of what was limiting us yesterday. And we convince ourselves, if I can't do that thing right now, if I couldn't do it yesterday, I could never do that. I could just never do that. I don't think I have it in me. And so think about how this might play out in your life. And this could be really any number of things. Right? Maybe it's a job promotion or a leadership opportunity in front of you. And sometimes, these are the things that we tend to look at like, man, they're so big. I don't know if I could ever do that. I came across a really interesting statistic a number of years ago, and this was something that came out of an article published in the Harvard Business Review. And this has been around for a while. But the statistic goes something like this, that when it comes to job opportunities and open positions and things like that, men have a tendency to submit their profile, their paperwork, resume, whatever, if they feel confident that they meet at least 60% of those qualifications. Just 60%, which is a little underwhelming, like if we're being honest. So I think we could probably aim a little higher, guys. But 60%, if that's all it takes, and a guy will send his information. On the other hand, now, a woman, again, just according to these statistics, just generally speaking, a woman won't even think about sending her application or her resume if she's not convinced that she meets 100% of the qualifications, which is really interesting, isn't it? Now, yes, and there's a lot of agreement on the row right here, lots of women there. So it is, and I think there's a lot of important insight in there that could easily take us off the point. I don't necessarily want to go there this morning, but I think it just speaks to this tension, doesn't it? That we hold back from opportunities that seem beyond our immediate capabilities. But this plays out in so many other areas of our lives, right? In our relationships, we might say, gosh, I've been hurt so many times before. I just don't know if I could ever put myself out there again, if I could ever open up again. We look at these big decisions in our life, moves that are before us, and we think, I just don't know if I'm the kind of person that can make a move like that, or if I could do something like that. And we can just play this out even further, because anytime a potentially life-changing opportunity comes our way, so often we look at those opportunities through the lens of limitations. And we convince ourselves that we just don't have it in us to take that leap. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus, this same mentality has a way of creeping into our faith journeys as well. In fact, maybe we've said something like this before, or maybe thought something like this before. I'm just not good at explaining my faith. I don't think I could ever do that. I could never lead a group or serve in a ministry. I just don't know enough of the Bible. I just don't think I have it in me. I'm not the kind of person that God would ever use like that. I'll never be as far along in my faith journey as that person. Like, I'll never have that kind of faith. Or I've always just kind of struggled with this thing, and I just don't know if I'm ever going to change. I just don't think I have it in me. Sometimes I think we're so focused on who we are right now that we forget who we can become and what we might be capable of with God's help. So today we're wrapping up this message series that we've been in called the 5 One Things. I've been in this series for a number of weeks now, and each of these weeks we've been looking at this little phrase that shows up in 5 different places all over the scriptures, this phrase, one thing. And each time we've looked at one of these scriptures, we've kind of approached it with this thought or this question, something along the lines of, what if one thing could change everything? In fact, I want to say just a little bit differently in light of where we're going with the message this morning. What if one thing could make anything possible? So I want us to hold that thought now as we make our way into the rest of the teaching this morning. The last one of these one thing passages is actually one that we've looked at fairly recently. In fact, going back to just the previous series, about a month ago, we looked at this together. And so at the risk of being maybe just a little bit repetitive, we're going to look at it again, but from a slightly different angle this time. The story is found in John's biography of Jesus, John chapter 9, and some of you will remember that Jesus enters this little community, and he sees this man begging on the side of the street, and we learn pretty quickly that this man has been blind since birth. So what does Jesus do when he sees this blind beggar? Well, naturally, he walks right up to him, and he spits in the dirt, and he mixes up a little mud, and he spreads the mud all over the man's eyes, right? I mean, of course, that's what Jesus does. I mean, what else would he do, right? So then this blind man goes and washes this mud off of his face, and as soon as he does that now, for the first time in his life, he can see. And so there's this miracle of healing that's happened in his life, and of course, as you would expect, that sort of sets him on this faith journey, and then we get to watch kind of this faith journey play out in his life through the events that follow, because naturally, his community, his neighbors, the people who knew him as a blind man, they want to know what happened. And so they're asking him about this, and listen to how he tries to explain it in response to their question, how have you gained your eyesight? This is verse 11 now in John 9. The beggar speaking, he says, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see. Now, it's really interesting because really this guy's at stage one in his faith journey, right? At this point, he just seems to know about Jesus, and just barely, right? I mean, he talks about it's the man they called Jesus. Like, there's not even a deep personal connection yet, but I think this is where a lot of us start in our faith journey, isn't it? We just sort of know about Jesus. I mean, every journey has to start somewhere, and this is where he's at. Now, we get to watch his journey continue to progress when he is later brought in and interrogated by the Pharisees. And that's what happens next. They take him in, and he's interrogated by these Pharisees. Now, for those who don't know, the Pharisees, they're like the religious authorities in this community. And the Pharisees, they had major issues with Jesus. They didn't like Jesus. And for a variety of reasons, but primarily they didn't like Jesus because he just had this tendency to upset some of their long-standing traditions. He was on occasion kind of getting into their face and confronting their hypocrisy, and for whatever reason, they just didn't appreciate that, you know? And so they had a lot of issues with Jesus, but one of the other reasons why they didn't appreciate Jesus is because he was breaking their laws. At least according to their evaluation, Jesus had a tendency to break some of their laws. For example, the Jews had this law of the Sabbath. The Sabbath, which is like this holy day of rest, one day a week set aside for rest, and it was strictly forbidden to do any kind of work on the Sabbath. Now, here's where the plot sort of thickens in our story with this blind beggar. Jesus healed this man on the Sabbath. And so apparently, at least according to the Pharisees, healing was really hard work. I mean, Jesus had to make the mud and everything. So clearly he has broken this law of the Sabbath, and now the Pharisees are trying to build a case against Jesus based on this man's story that Jesus is a lawbreaker. And as a lawbreaker, clearly he is in direct opposition to God, just fundamentally opposed to the ways of God. In their words, he's a sinner. Jesus is a sinner. But they're debating this point, the Pharisees, back and forth amongst themselves. Is he a sinner? Is he not? They're kind of going back and forth. And finally, they turn back to this beggar, and they put the question to him. They basically say, well, you're the guy that he healed, so what do you have to say about him? And this is his response in verse 17. He is a prophet. He is a prophet, which is really interesting because this seems to indicate another stage in this man's faith journey, doesn't it? Because by even suggesting that Jesus could be a prophet, this is evidence that stage 2 here in his faith journey, that there's a genuine faith that's beginning to take shape and is growing within him. And of course, he's not all the way there, not quite yet, right? Because Jesus was so much more than just a prophet, but he's moving in the right direction. Because he's acknowledging that Jesus must have as a prophet, he would have some kind of special and unique connection to the divine. I mean, that's a prophet, someone with a connection to God that enables them to do some pretty unique and extraordinary things. And of course, the Pharisees didn't love that response. They didn't like the fact or the idea that Jesus would be a prophet. Because, first of all, the Pharisees, they couldn't stand the idea that Jesus was a legitimate miracle worker. They just hated that idea. But they also couldn't stand the fact that this beggar was now insinuating that Jesus was on the same level as some of their heroes of the faith. Like they're in this moment thinking, wait a second, you're saying this lawbreaker, this sinner Jesus, is on the same level as someone like Elijah or Moses? And so they're like, we've got to shut this down right here and right now. And so they continue their interrogations. They take this another step further, and this time they bring in the beggar's parents. And they start grilling his parents. And they're like, it's like the spotlight shined on their faces. They're like, is this man even really your son? Was he ever even blind in the first place? And if he was, then explain to us how he can now see. And this was, the parents here were like rattled, and at least they did acknowledge, yes, this is our son. We will claim him as our son. And yes, we can tell you, we know very well, he's been blind since birth. But then after that, they kind of panic. And they kind of throw their son under the bus a little bit. They're like, listen, he's a grown man. He can speak for himself. They're like, we don't want to get caught up in his stuff. He's on his own. And this just goes to show how intimidating the whole experience was. For the parents, for this beggar. These Pharisees had the authority to make their lives incredibly difficult. And so one wrong move, one careless word or comment could be disastrous. And so that's why we see the parents kind of getting a little skittish here. And they're like, go talk to our son. Let him speak for himself. And so the Pharisees, they go back to the beggar for more questioning. But this time, they're really turning up the heat. They're getting really aggressive. And in a climactic moment, they're basically shouting at this beggar, we want the truth. And the beggar shouts back, you can't handle the truth, Kind of a little courtroom drama happening here. But here's what he actually said. And here's that phrase, our phrase that we've been looking at for the past few weeks, one more time. Here's what he says, verse 25. He replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know. I was blind, but now I see. Think about this. Here's this man, fresh off the streets, standing in the most intimidating room imaginable. But instead of crumbling under the pressure, he goes toe-to-toe with the most powerful people in that community. He stands his ground. And he basically tells them, listen, I don't know your theology, all right? I don't know the law in and out like you guys. In fact, there's a whole lot that I don't know, to be honest. But I do know one thing. Yesterday I couldn't see. Today I can. And as inconvenient as that might be for you and as uncomfortable as that may make you feel, it is undeniable. And the only thing that's changed between then and now, Jesus showed up. Jesus found me. It's Jesus. Is basically what this beggar is telling the Pharisees, and they scoff at him. And they begin to mock both him and Jesus. They say about Jesus, they're like, we don't even know where this man comes from. And here's where things get truly interesting. Because what comes out of this street beggar's mouth next shocks even him. And in this moment, this beggar takes these self-righteous religious experts to school. And this is so good. Verses 30 and 33, look at what he says. The man answered, the beggar is speaking here, he says, Now that is remarkable. I mean, just can you hear the tone here? This is awesome. I love this. Now, he said, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. In other words, you guys are the religious experts. And you can't figure this out. I mean, just look at what he's done. Right? I mean, you of all people should be able to connect the dots here. And actually, this moment reveals another stage in this man's faith journey. Beyond just having his eyes opened, this man was totally transformed. Transformed. More than just physical healing. Something deeper was going on within. There's a boldness there. There's this strength of character that he didn't even know was in him, right? In fact, I would argue it wasn't there. He didn't have it in him until he had been with Jesus. This reminds me of another story when two of Jesus' followers had almost the same exact experience. Very, very similar. It was after the resurrection at this point, and Peter and John, two of Jesus' closest followers and best friends, they were upsetting the religious authorities. Again, by going around and teaching about Jesus, and they were going around performing these miracles, and the religious authorities, the Jewish council, they were getting all antsy and upset about this, and so they had Peter and John brought in for questioning. Right? Again, this all sounds very familiar. It was getting very aggressive, and just like the beggar in John 9, Peter and John, in this moment, they squared up to the Jewish council, to their aggressive questioning. I mean, these bigwigs with power and authority over them, they stood their ground with a boldness that caught everyone off guard. And I love what it says here in Acts chapter 4, verse 13. Look at this. When they saw, the council, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished. And they took note that these men had been with Jesus. I mean, really, there's only one thing that stood out to these religious experts about Peter and John in this moment and why they were so courageous and why they were so articulate. And it wasn't their education, because they didn't have any formal education. It wasn't their training, because they were fishermen. They were trained in the ways of catching fish, right? It wasn't their status, because these guys were nobodies. But they had been with Jesus. And when we look at the blind man in John 9, and when we look at Peter and John in Acts 4, one thing is clear. Their boldness didn't come from themselves. In fact, they were experiencing firsthand something that Jesus had talked about himself a little bit earlier. When we go back to Matthew chapter 10, look at what Jesus says here. These are the words of Jesus. When they arrest you, which is interesting again, because I mean, everyone we've looked at so far has been taken into custody, right, and questioned. They've been arrested. So Jesus anticipated this. He knew this would happen. He says, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time, you will be given what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. And this is what I find so powerful in these stories. These stories show us, our bottom line this morning, that a life changed by Jesus is a life empowered by His Spirit. I mean, the one thing this once blind man knew, his life was different. Not just healed, but transformed. And his story reminds us that following Jesus is really this journey of spiritual transformation one step at a time. And we see in his life what so many of us have experienced as well. That Jesus finds us in our darkness. He finds us in our brokenness. And he invites us to follow him out of that darkness and out of that brokenness with an outstretched hand. And by his grace, he gives us the ability and the strength to take each and every step as we follow him. Because here's the thing, I mean, it wasn't the beggar who stood up to the Pharisees that day. And it wasn't Peter and John who stood up to the Jewish council. It was the Spirit of God empowering them and speaking through them. And think about this. The scriptures tell us this, that the same power that actually reversed this man's congenital condition of blindness, in fact, it's the same power, the scriptures say, that raised Jesus from the dead. That same power lives in you and lives in me as followers of Jesus. And it's that same power that takes you and me from who we were yesterday and transforms us into the person we're becoming tomorrow. But see, I think this is where a lot of us often get confused in our faith journeys, because we think it's up to us. We think it's all about us. But Jesus explains this differently. And we looked at this just briefly last week in Justin's teaching, which if you were here last week, Justin did a fantastic job. But briefly he touched on this. But as we bring this whole series to a close, I thought this is so important. We need to look at this one more time because it's just a beautiful reminder of this analogy, this imagery that Jesus gives us. And so I just want to touch on this really briefly in John 15:5. Look what Jesus says here. He says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. And I think most of us, we get the basic idea behind this word picture, right? It's kind of like, yeah, okay. And some of us have heard this enough. It's like, okay, yeah, the vine grows the branches grow the fruit. Yeah, and no vine, no fruit. I get it. But here's where I think we may get just a little mixed up, or maybe we just miss this, because a lot of times we look at this analogy and we think it's the branch that's growing the fruit, when in fact it's the vine growing the fruit through the branch. And this changes everything, doesn't it? Because here's what so often happens, and I'll just speak for myself and maybe others can relate. Sometimes we want the fruit before the vine. In other words, I'll say it this way. I want the courage first, and then I'll follow Jesus. Like give me the peace and the joy up front, and then, yes, I'll stay with Jesus. Or give me everything that I need first, and then I'll take that step. Maybe then I'll say yes to Jesus. Maybe I'll say yes to God. I'll trust God. Maybe I'll step into that opportunity that's in front of me, even while everything inside of me is telling me I can't do this. Maybe I'll move then. But anytime we do this, anytime we put the fruit before the vine, it always gets reduced to our own striving. And the problem with that is any fruit that is produced from our own striving just isn't real or lasting fruit. One of the best, or at the very least amusing illustrations of this comes from a highly underrated theologian, SpongeBob SquarePants. Anyone familiar with this show? Maybe you watched it, or if not, this could be an awkward few moments for us, but I'm going to go for it anyway. My kids used to watch this on occasion. I used to watch episodes here and there, or I would walk in and catch a scene or two, and it is kind of funny. But there was one scene that I caught years ago that it's always cracked me up. And what little I know of this particular episode, SpongeBob and his buddy Patrick, they end up somehow with seaweed on their lips, and they think that they've grown these powerful mustaches, and they're really proud of these mustaches. Until another guy, a much more macho guy, comes along and tells them, no, those are fake mustaches. And then he says, okay, I'm going to show you what a real mustache looks like. So there's the context. I've actually got this scene in a clip, so let's take a look at this.
This is what a real mustache looks like.
Okay, there it is right there. I mean, come on. Wouldn't that be awesome, guys, if you could just kind of force out like this lush, full mustache on command like that? I've always thought that'd be kind of cool, right? Of course, we know it doesn't work like that. You can't just push out a full Tom Selleck or Andy Reid mustache in all its glory. It takes time, and besides, it's more about genetics than it is effort anyway. But as ridiculous as that little scene is, it's actually a perfect example of what it looks like when we try to manufacture the fruits of the Spirit in our own strength. It's like we're over here just straining and striving, and we're trying so hard to force our own courage and our own strength and our own boldness and our own abilities. But at the end of it all, apart from Jesus, apart from the vine, the reality is we just don't have it in us. And Jesus says, as the branches, our only job is to remain in Him. Other versions say abide, like make your home in him. Stay connected to him. And when we do that, his Spirit fills us and empowers us and flows through us, and it produces this fruit of transformation in our lives. And so here's our invitation this morning, as we kind of bring this, not just this message to a close, but as we bring really this entire series to a close. Just a moment where we can respond to this in some way. And it's just simply an invitation to follow Jesus into the opportunity that's in front of you. But it's also an invitation to do that in his strength and not in yours. To rely on his strength and not your own. You know, the interesting thing is that this man born blind in John 9, I mean, he didn't find the courage to face the Pharisees until he was standing right there in front of them. You know? And then, you know, Peter and John, like, they didn't have the boldness to square up to the Jewish council like they did until they were already there. And the reality is that Jesus doesn't promise us everything we need in advance. He promises what we need when we need it. When we trust him. When we remain in him and rely on his strength. And in a lot of ways, I mean, this is what we've been talking about through this entire series. You know, each and every time we've looked at this little phrase, one thing, it's challenged our priorities, but it's also pointed us toward a more centered life. A life that is centered around Jesus, a life that is remaining in him as branches connected to the vine. But in order for us to do that, I mean, just kind of doing a quick sweep through everything we talked about through the course of this series, in order to remain in Jesus and stay connected to him, we have to let go of the one thing we're holding on to that's holding us back. If you remember from week 1, we talked about this. I mean, whether that's an idol in our life, or maybe it's our past shame and regrets, or maybe it's just a fear. But there's something we're holding on to that's holding us back. We have to let it go. We have to pursue the presence of God like it's the one thing we desire. And you know, so often that just means slowing down. So often that just looks like sitting at the feet of Jesus, like we talked about last week, like Justin talked about. Soaking in his words through the scriptures. You know, so often pursuing his presence is just sitting still long enough to recognize that he's actually pursuing you. He's pursuing your heart. He's pursuing a relationship with you. He wants you to be in his presence with him. Because it's in his presence that we find peace. It's in his presence that we find his grace. It's in his presence that we discover the strength that we need to press on, like we talked about a few weeks ago. To press on with a driving passion, like it's the one thing we do, like it's the one thing we're after, to know Jesus more and more, so that more and more we look like Jesus, we become like him. And again, not in our own efforts, not in our own strength, but in his. So just a question for us as we wind down this morning. What is it that's in front of you? What opportunity is it that God is inviting you into right now? And every time you think about this thing, every time it comes up, every time somebody mentions it, you just have this, it's like this old narrative just kicks in again. It's like, oh, I don't know if I could ever do that. I just don't know if I have it in me. What is that for you? Whatever it is, what if you decided to just follow Jesus into it? What if you decided to trust his strength when you feel like your strength is failing? What if you just decided to trust his knowledge when you feel like yours is limited? What if you decided to trust his wisdom when you feel inadequate? To trust his vision for your life when you can't see beyond the next step? What if you just decided in this moment to trust his grace when you feel disqualified? Remember, a life changed by Jesus is a life empowered by his Spirit. And if we all, every single one of us, just became convinced of that one thing, then I just believe anything God wants to do in us, anything that God wants to do through us, anything that he is calling us into, I just believe it's possible. When we pursue that in his strength and we follow him into it. Let's pray. Father, I know that there's someone, and maybe more than a few of us here this morning, who are processing a big move, something in front of them. Lord, they've been wrestling with this, hesitant because they're just wondering if they really have it in them. But Lord, you've maybe put this opportunity in front of them. Maybe you're inviting them to step into this with you, to follow you into this. So Father, whatever that looks like for any one of us, would you just give us that courage? Would you give us that strength? Would you give us that assurance that we won't step into this alone, that we won't step into this in our own power, but that when we follow you, you supply everything we need. You promise whatever we need when we need it. So would we follow you there? Father, we love you. Jesus, we are so grateful for your love and your grace. And we pray this in your name. Amen. Thank you, Cypress. We'll see you next Sunday.